In this story, we dive into the life of David, a dedicated husband and head cook at a small-town diner, who begins to feel the strain in his marriage when a new coworker, Jake, starts forming a close bond with his wife, Emily. As doubts and insecurities creep into his heart, David is forced to confront the challenges of trust, love, and the fear of losing everything he's built. Join us as we explore the emotional journey of a man navigating the delicate boundaries of relationships and the impact of a cheating wife in the shadows of his mind. David wiped his brow, feeling the familiar heat radiating from the ovens as the smell of baking dough and simmering sauces filled the air. Sunshine Diner was alive with the sounds of plates clinking, customers chatting, and the faint hum of the radio playing classic rock in the background. It was a typical Saturday night, and the dinner rush was just beginning to pick up. Nestled in the heart of a quiet suburb, Sunshine Diner was the kind of place where locals came to relax after a long day, families gathered for weekend meals, and teenagers hung out after school. The walls were adorned with old photographs of the town, a few vintage signs, and the menu that had barely changed in the last decade. It was comforting, in its way, a place where the passage of time seemed slower, more deliberate. David had worked here for years, taking over as head cook when the previous one retired. He knew the kitchen like the back of his hand, the way the oven had a slight hot spot on the left side, the way the fryer would hiss if you didn't place the basket in just right, and the way the door creaked ever so slightly whenever someone entered the kitchen. It was his domain, a place where he felt in control, where he could lose himself in the rhythm of chopping, stirring, and plating. But lately, something had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a faint breeze that barely rustled the leaves. But now, that breeze had grown stronger, and David could no longer ignore it. "David, can you get 2 more veggie specials ready? Table 5's got a birthday party," called Emily, his wife, from the front counter. Her voice was warm, carrying over the clatter of dishes and the chatter of customers. Emily had always been the heart of Sunshine Diner. Her bright smile and easygoing nature made her a favorite among the regulars. She could talk to anyone, make them feel welcome, and knew everyone's favorite dish. Whether it was the elderly couple who always shared a slice of pie or the young mother who came in with her toddler every Wednesday, Emily knew them all. She was the reason people kept coming back. David glanced over at her, watching as she expertly handled the crowd at the front. Her long brown hair was pulled back into a ponytail, a few loose strands framing her face. She wore the same uniform as everyone else, a simple white shirt and black apron, but on her, it looked like it had been made just for her. Her smile, as always, was genuine, lighting up her entire face. "Sure thing, love," David replied, his tone light, though a flicker of concern crossed his face as he turned back to his work. He reached for the fresh vegetables, his hands moving automatically as he began to prep the orders. Emily's voice had always been a source of comfort for him, but tonight, it felt different. There was something else there, something that had been gnawing at him for weeks now. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew it had to do with Jake, the new guy who had started working at the diner a few months ago. Jake was everything David wasn't. He was outgoing, charismatic, and had a way with people that drew them in. He could strike up a conversation with anyone, make them laugh, and leave them feeling like they had just made a new friend. He was also young, in his mid-20s, with an easygoing smile and a talent for music that he wasn't shy about showing off. From the moment Jake had started, he and Emily had hit it off. It wasn't that David was jealous, at least, that's what he told himself, but there was something about the way they interacted that left him feeling uneasy. They shared inside jokes, talked about bands David had never heard of, and seemed to have a connection that he and Emily had never had. David shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He was being ridiculous, he told himself. Emily loved him, and Jake was just a coworker. There was nothing more to it. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. As the night wore on, David found himself glancing over at the front more often than usual. He watched as Emily and Jake laughed together, their heads bent close as they discussed something on her phone. Jake was probably showing her a new band or a song he thought she'd like. David knew that Emily had always been passionate about music, something he had never quite shared with her. He liked music well enough, but it had never been a central part of his life the way it was for her. The term, gang days, which Jake had coined to describe the mornings when he and Emily worked together without David, didn't sit well with him either. It was just a joke, Emily had assured him one night, laughing it off as she reached out to squeeze his arm reassuringly. "You know you're my number one," she had said, her eyes full of love. But was he? David couldn't help but wonder as he slid another pizza into the oven. The ease with which Emily and Jake interacted, the way they laughed together, the plans they made to see a concert, it all seemed to point to something more than just friendship. David wasn't sure what to make of it, but he knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. Later that evening, as the dinner rush began to ebb, David decided it was time for a candid conversation. He needed to express his feelings, to lay out his fears without sounding accusatory. But every time he looked at Emily, laughing and smiling with Jake, his resolve waned. How could he question her loyalty without causing a rift? He was still mulling over his thoughts when Emily approached him, her eyes bright with concern. "David, are you okay? You've been quiet all evening," she asked, her voice gentle. David forced a smile, his heart heavy. "Yeah, just tired, I guess. It's been a long day." Emily nodded, patting his arm affectionately before returning to the counter where Jake was waiting with a new playlist to share. David watched them, his heart sinking a little more with each laugh they shared. As the night drew to a close and the last customer left, David knew this couldn't go on. He had to talk to Emily, to clear the air. But first, he needed to sort out his own feelings. Was it just insecurity, or was there something more to his unease? Tonight, after the lights were dimmed and the diner was quiet, he would find out. The Saturday morning shift began like any other, the diner coming to life as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the large front windows. The air was crisp, with a gentle breeze that carried the promise of a bright, bustling day. David arrived at the Sunshine Diner earlier than usual, his mind still wrestling with the thoughts that had kept him awake most of the night. The conversations with himself, the doubts and questions, had swirled around endlessly, leaving him more tired than he'd care to admit. As he walked through the back entrance, the familiar sounds of the kitchen greeted him, the clatter of pots and pans, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sizzle of something frying on the stove. But today, those sounds felt different, almost distant, as if the comforting routine of his work had been subtly altered by the unease that now gripped him. David found Emily in the kitchen, already hard at work. She was prepping the dough, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Standing next to her, chatting animatedly, was Jake. The two of them were laughing about something, their voices echoing off the tiled walls, the sound like a cheerful tune that only they could hear. "Morning, David," Emily greeted him cheerily, brushing a strand of hair from her face with her flour-dusted hand. Her smile was as bright as the sunlight streaming through the windows, but David could sense a slight hesitation in her eyes, a fleeting glimpse of concern as she looked at him. "Morning," David replied, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He walked over to the prep station, setting down his bag and tying on his apron. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he tried to focus on the tasks at hand rather than the gnawing feeling in his chest. Jake found this amazing new band. "You should really give them a listen," Emily said, trying to engage him in the conversation. David nodded, his tone more curt than he intended. "Maybe later." Emily's brow furrowed slightly, picking up on his tone, but before she could respond, the first order of the day came in. The kitchen quickly fell into its usual rhythm, with orders coming in steadily, the familiar routine taking over. But even as David focused on his work, he couldn't shake the feeling of being on the outside looking in. As the morning progressed, David found himself watching Emily and Jake from the corner of his eye. They moved around each other with an ease that spoke of many shared shifts. Every so often, they would burst into laughter over a private joke or a song lyric, and each time, David felt a pang of exclusion, a feeling that had become all too familiar. The diner was busy, with customers coming in for their weekend breakfast fix, pancakes, bacon, eggs, and the occasional special that Sunshine Diner was known for. The clinking of cutlery and the low murmur of conversations filled the space, blending into a comforting background noise. But to David, everything felt slightly off-kilter, as if he were out of sync with the world around him. Determined to address his growing unease, David decided it was time to step out of the shadows of his doubts. He couldn't keep ignoring the feelings that were gnawing away at him, eroding the foundation of his relationship with Emily. During a brief lull, he approached her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Can we talk?" David asked, his voice low enough to ensure Jake wouldn't overhear. Emily looked up from the specials board she was updating, her expression shifting from concentration to concern. "Of course. What's up?" "Not here," David said, glancing over at Jake, who was taking inventory near the back. "Maybe on your break?" Emily nodded, a trace of apprehension in her eyes. "Sure, let's go for a walk." As they resumed their tasks, David's thoughts raced ahead to the conversation they were about to have. He knew he had to be careful with his words, to express his feelings without coming across as accusing or insecure. He didn't want to push Emily away, but he couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. When their break time finally arrived, David and Emily stepped outside into the brisk morning air. The world outside the diner was quiet, the early hour leaving the streets mostly empty. They walked in silence for a few minutes, their footsteps echoing on the pavement as they headed towards a nearby park, a small, quiet space with a few benches and a view of a serene pond. It was a place they often visited together, a little escape from the hustle and bustle of the diner, but today it felt different. The usual comfort of the park was overshadowed by the weight of the conversation ahead. As they reached the park, Emily led them to a familiar bench near the pond. The water shimmered under the morning sun, the surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple from a gentle breeze. They sat down, the bench creaking slightly under their weight, and David took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Emily," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him, "I need to be honest about how I've been feeling." Emily turned to face him, her expression open and attentive. "What's going on, David?" David looked down at his hands, which were clenched together in his lap. He forced himself to relax them, to meet Emily's gaze. "It's about you and Jake. The closeness you two share. It's been hard for me." Emily's face softened, her eyes filled with concern. "David, I didn't realize it was affecting you so much. Jake is just a friend, you know that, right?" "I know you say that," David replied, his voice tinged with the frustration that had been building for weeks, "but it feels like more than just friendship sometimes. The way you two are together, the inside jokes, the plans to see concerts. I feel like I'm losing you to him." Emily reached out and took David's hand in hers, her touch warm and reassuring. "You're not losing me, David. I love you. Jake and I might share some interests that you and I don't, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. I'm sorry if it made you feel left out." David felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief that Emily had acknowledged his feelings, and lingering doubt that he couldn't quite shake. "I just want to feel like I'm part of your world, too," he admitted, his voice betraying the vulnerability he had been trying to hide. Emily squeezed his hand, her resolve clear. "We can fix this, David. I'll make sure you don't feel excluded. Maybe we can all hang out together? Get to know each other better?" The suggestion didn't sit well with David, but he nodded, willing to try if it meant reclaiming the sense of partnership he and Emily once shared. "Okay," he said, though the word felt heavy on his tongue. "We can try that." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds being the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emily leaned into David, resting her head on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but one that brought him a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in days. He wanted to believe that everything would be all right, that they could move past this and find their way back to each other. As they walked back to the diner, the silence between them was no longer tense, but rather filled with unspoken understanding. David knew that this was just the beginning of a longer journey to harmony, but he also knew that he wasn't alone in it. Emily was by his side, and for now, that was enough. Back at the diner, the atmosphere was as lively as ever, but the undercurrents of tension between David and Emily cast a shadow over the usual cheerfulness. Jake, oblivious to the conversation that had just taken place, greeted them with his usual buoyant energy, holding up a new playlist on his phone. "Check this out when you get a chance, David. I think even you might like this one," Jake said with a grin, his enthusiasm as infectious as always. David managed a nod, his smile strained but genuine. "Sure, I'll give it a listen." As he watched Emily and Jake fall back into their easy rapport, a mix of emotions churned within him. He appreciated Emily's assurances, but the ease with which she reverted to her jovial interactions with Jake left him feeling unsettled. The idea of joining them, of trying to fit into a dynamic already so firmly established, felt daunting. Over the next few days, David tried to engage more with Jake, hoping to ease the discomfort that lingered between them. He joined in on conversations about music, a subject he rarely ventured into, and even discussed the latest sports news. Jake was friendly and welcoming, but to David, each conversation felt like a reminder of his own insecurities. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding on a space that wasn't his. One afternoon, as David was rearranging supplies in the storage room, he overheard Emily and Jake planning to attend another concert together. The way Emily laughed, her voice filled with excitement, sent a sharp pang through him. He paused, the box in his hands forgotten, as the reality of their plans hit him. It wasn't just about music or shared shifts. It was about shared experiences, ones from which he felt distinctly isolated. David knew he couldn't go on like this. He needed to confront the issue head-on, to have another conversation, but this time, it would involve all three of them. He suggested they meet at a local cafe after work, a neutral ground where they could talk openly. Emily agreed, though she seemed apprehensive, and Jake, ever oblivious to the deeper tensions, accepted with his usual easygoing charm. As they sat down at the cafe, the atmosphere was a mix of nervous energy and tentative hope. The soft glow of overhead lights cast a warm ambiance over the small table they shared, the clinking of cups and the murmur of other patrons providing a comforting backdrop to the conversation ahead. David knew this was his chance to lay everything out in the open. He needed to express his feelings more openly than he had before, to address the discomfort that had been festering for too long. "I want to be honest with both of you," David began, his voice firm yet tinged with vulnerability. He looked at Emily, then at Jake, both of whom were watching him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "I've been feeling left out of your friendship. It's great that you two get along so well, but sometimes, it feels like I'm on the outside looking in." Jake looked genuinely surprised, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed David's words. "Man, I had no idea you felt that way. I'm really sorry, David. I didn't mean to make you feel excluded." Emily reached out, her hand covering David's. "I'm sorry, too. I never wanted to make you feel that way. We both love working with you, and I love you, David. Maybe we've gotten a bit carried away with our new friendship." The conversation that followed was a turning point. It wasn't easy for David to voice his insecurities, nor was it comfortable for Emily and Jake to hear them. But the honesty that permeated their discussion paved the way for a deeper understanding. Jake suggested that instead of just him and Emily attending the concert, all three of them should go together. "It could be fun, a chance for us to all hang out outside of work," he proposed, his tone earnest. David hesitated, the offer unexpected and slightly intimidating. But seeing the genuine effort from both Jake and Emily, he nodded, albeit with some reservations. "Okay, let's do that. It could be a good start." As they left the cafe, a tentative plan in place, David felt a cautious sense of hope. Perhaps this was the way forward, a path to understanding and inclusivity that he hadn't considered before. The road to harmony might be longer and more complex than he had anticipated, but with open hearts and minds, it seemed a little more attainable. The tension between David and Emily didn't disappear overnight, but it began to ease as they navigated this new chapter together. David knew that the journey ahead would require patience, trust, and a willingness to embrace the changes in their relationship. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. As they walked back to the diner, the sun beginning its descent, casting long shadows on the pavement, David took a deep breath. The air was cool and crisp, the evening light casting a golden hue over everything. He reached out and took Emily's hand, squeezing it gently. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of love and determination. "We'll get through this," Emily said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength that David had always admired. "Yeah," David replied, his voice steady. "We will." And for the first time in a long time, David truly believed it. The sun was setting by the time David, Emily, and Jake made their way back to Sunshine Diner. The warmth of the day was giving way to a cool evening breeze, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, casting a serene glow over the quiet suburb. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few late commuters and the occasional dog walker. The world felt calm, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the resolution of the tension that had been building between them. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was much the same as they had left it. The smell of food still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee and the familiar hum of the refrigerator. It was quiet now, with most of the dinner crowd having finished their meals and left. Only a few regulars remained, sipping their drinks and chatting softly in the dim light. David felt the weight of the conversation they had just had at the cafe settle over him like a heavy blanket. It was a strange mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that they had finally addressed the issue that had been looming over them for weeks, but also recognizing that there was still a long way to go. Emily was walking slightly ahead of him, her hand still warm in his. She had been quiet on the way back, and David could tell that she was deep in thought, processing everything that had been said. He wished he could read her mind, to know exactly what she was thinking, but he also knew that they both needed time to absorb everything. Jake, ever the optimist, seemed more upbeat. He had always been the type to take things in stride, to find the silver lining in any situation. David envied that about him, the way he could shake off the heavy emotions and move forward with a light heart. But at the same time, he knew that Jake's carefree attitude was part of what had made him feel so out of place in his own life lately. As they re-entered the diner, Jake gave them both a reassuring smile. "I'm really glad we talked things out," he said, his voice earnest. "I know it wasn't easy, but I think it was important. We're all on the same page now, right?" David nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. "Yeah, I think so," he replied, trying to match Jake's optimism. But in the back of his mind, the doubts lingered. He couldn't help but wonder if things would really change, or if this was just a temporary reprieve from the tension that had been building. Emily, sensing the hesitation in David's voice, turned to him and squeezed his hand gently. "We'll make it work, David. I promise," she said softly, her eyes full of sincerity. David wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that they could find their way back to each other. But there was still a part of him that remained skeptical, that feared the cracks in their relationship were deeper than either of them realized. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. They finished up the last of the cleaning and closing tasks in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. David could feel the tension still simmering beneath the surface, but he was too tired to address it further. He knew that they needed to take things one step at a time, to rebuild the trust that had been eroded by weeks of uncertainty and doubt. By the time they left the diner for the night, the streets were dark and the air had turned cool. David and Emily walked home together, their footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The conversation from earlier hung between them, unspoken but ever present, like a shadow that followed them home. When they finally reached their small, cozy house, David felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion settle over him. The emotional weight of the day had taken its toll, and all he wanted to do was collapse into bed and forget about everything for a little while. But as they stepped inside, he knew that sleep wouldn't come easily tonight. There were still too many thoughts racing through his mind, too many unresolved questions. Emily seemed to sense his unease. She led him to the living room, where they both sank onto the couch, the soft cushions offering a small comfort in the face of their shared turmoil. "Do you want to talk about it some more?" Emily asked gently, her hand resting on his arm. David shook his head, leaning back against the cushions and closing his eyes for a moment. "Not right now," he admitted, his voice tinged with fatigue. "I just need to clear my head." Emily nodded, understanding. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, they simply sat there in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. David appreciated the quiet comfort of her presence, the way she didn't push him to talk or demand answers. It was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she knew when to give him space, when to let him process things in his own time. But even as they sat there, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. He knew that the conversation they had earlier was a step in the right direction, but it was just that, a step. There were still so many things left unsaid, so many feelings left unexamined. Eventually, they made their way to bed, the weight of the day still heavy on their shoulders. David lay awake for a long time, staring up at the ceiling, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. He could hear Emily's soft breathing beside him, a steady rhythm that should have been soothing, but instead only served to amplify his own unease. He knew that he needed to find a way to reconcile his feelings, to come to terms with the changes that had been happening in their relationship. But he wasn't sure how to do that, or where to even begin. All he knew was that he couldn't go on like this, constantly questioning, doubting, feeling like he was losing his grip on the life he had built with Emily. The next morning, David woke up feeling more tired than he had the night before. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light through the curtains. Emily was still asleep beside him, her face peaceful in the early morning light. For a moment, David allowed himself to simply watch her, to take in the quiet beauty of the woman he loved. But the peace was fleeting, and as the memories of the previous day came rushing back, David felt the weight of his doubts settle over him once again. He knew that they couldn't keep avoiding the issue, that they needed to have another conversation, one that went deeper, that addressed the root of the problem. He waited until Emily woke up before broaching the subject again. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, when David finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves that churned in his stomach. Emily looked up from her cup, her expression open and attentive. "I have too," she said softly. "I'm really glad we talked things out, but I know there's still a lot we need to work through." David nodded, feeling a small surge of relief that they were on the same page. "I just don't want us to ignore this, to let it fester and grow into something bigger than it already is." "We won't," Emily assured him, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I don't want to lose what we have, David. I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." David squeezed her hand, feeling a flicker of hope ignite in his chest. "I love you too, Emily. And I want to make this work, I really do. But I think we need to figure out what's causing these feelings in the first place." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think you're right. Maybe we should talk to someone, like a counselor or something. It might help to have an outside perspective, someone who can help us work through this together." The idea of seeing a counselor wasn't something David had considered before, but as he thought about it, he realized that it might be exactly what they needed. They had always been able to work through their problems on their own, but this time felt different, more complicated, more deeply rooted in emotions they didn't fully understand. "Yeah, that might be a good idea," David agreed, feeling a sense of relief at the thought of having someone to guide them through this difficult time. They spent the rest of the morning talking about their options, researching counselors in the area and discussing what they hoped to get out of the sessions. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was a productive one, and by the time they left the house to head back to the diner, David felt like they were finally taking the right steps. The day at the diner passed in a blur of activity, with the usual rush of customers keeping them both busy. But even in the midst of the chaos, there was a sense of calm between David and Emily, a quiet understanding that they were in this together, that they were willing to put in the work to rebuild what had been shaken. When Jake arrived for his shift later in the day, the three of them exchanged a few words, but the easy camaraderie that had once existed between them felt strained, as if there were an invisible barrier that none of them knew how to cross. David knew that this was just another part of the process, that it would take time to rebuild the trust and ease that had once come so naturally. As the day turned into evening, and the last of the customers trickled out, David found himself alone in the kitchen, cleaning up the last of the dishes. The diner was quiet now, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft clinking of plates as he stacked them in the sink. Emily and Jake were in the front, finishing up the closing tasks, and as David listened to the distant murmur of their voices, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the same as the peace he had known before all of this began, but it was a start, a tentative step towards healing. As they locked up the diner and headed home, the night air cool against their skin, David felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. When they finally reached their house, David turned to Emily, his heart full of a mixture of hope and apprehension. "We'll get through this," he said softly, echoing her words from the night before. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with love and determination. "Yes, we will." And as they walked inside, hand in hand, David knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The decision to seek counseling marked a significant turning point for David and Emily. It was an acknowledgement that their relationship needed outside help, that the issues they were facing were too complex to untangle on their own. The days that followed were filled with a mix of anticipation and anxiety as they prepared for their first session. They chose a counselor named Dr. Margaret Lewis, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for being both empathetic and direct. She had a cozy office in the downtown area, decorated with soft, muted tones and comfortable furniture. There were paintings of serene landscapes on the walls, and a few potted plants added a touch of warmth to the room. It was a space designed to make people feel at ease, to encourage open conversation. David and Emily sat side by side on a plush couch, their hands intertwined as they waited for Dr. Lewis to begin. She sat across from them in a cushioned chair, a notebook resting on her lap. Her eyes were kind, her demeanor calm and welcoming. "Thank you both for coming in today," Dr. Lewis began, her voice steady and soothing. "I understand that seeking counseling can be a difficult decision, but it's an important step towards working through any challenges you're facing. So, tell me a bit about what brought you here today." David glanced at Emily, silently encouraging her to speak first. She nodded slightly and took a deep breath before speaking. "We've been having some issues lately," Emily started, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It started a few months ago when a new coworker joined our team at the diner. His name is Jake, and he and I became friends pretty quickly. But as our friendship grew, David started feeling left out and, maybe a little insecure." David felt a pang of guilt as Emily spoke, but he knew she was just being honest. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance that they were in this together. "It's not that I don't trust Emily," David added, his voice low but steady. "I know she loves me, and I love her. But the way she and Jake have connected, it's been hard for me to deal with. I've been feeling like an outsider in my own life, like I'm losing her to someone else." Dr. Lewis nodded, her expression thoughtful as she listened. "It sounds like there's been a lot of emotional distance between the two of you lately. That can be really challenging, especially in a marriage. How have you both been handling these feelings up until now?" "We've talked about it a few times," Emily replied, glancing at David. "But it's been difficult to really address the underlying issues. I think we've both been trying to protect each other's feelings, but in doing so, we haven't been as open as we need to be. I've been trying to be more involved," David added, "to spend time with them and not let it bother me. But it's been hard. I feel like I'm always on the outside looking in." Dr. Lewis nodded again, her pen moving across the notebook as she jotted down a few notes. "It's good that you've both been trying to communicate, but it's also important to recognize that it's okay to feel what you're feeling. Jealousy, insecurity, and fear are natural emotions, especially when it comes to relationships. The key is learning how to manage those emotions in a healthy way, and that's something we can work on together." David felt a flicker of hope at her words. Maybe this really could help. Maybe they could find a way back to the closeness they once shared. "For now," Dr. Lewis continued, "I'd like to focus on rebuilding the emotional connection between the two of you. It's clear that you both love each other and want to make this work, but it's also clear that there's been a breakdown in communication. I'd like to explore ways to strengthen that bond, to help you both feel more secure and connected." David and Emily both nodded, their hands still tightly clasped together. They were ready to do the work, to put in the effort needed to heal the fractures in their relationship. Over the next few weeks, David and Emily attended regular sessions with Dr. Lewis. Each session was a step forward, a chance to peel back the layers of hurt and misunderstanding that had built up between them. They talked about their fears, their insecurities, and the ways in which they had unintentionally hurt each other. Dr. Lewis guided them through exercises designed to improve their communication and deepen their emotional connection. They learned how to listen to each other more effectively, to express their feelings without fear of judgment or rejection. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the process felt overwhelming, but they kept at it, determined to rebuild the foundation of their marriage. One exercise that had a profound impact on them was a simple one. They were asked to spend 10 minutes each day just talking to each other. No distractions, no interruptions, just a focused, meaningful conversation. At first, it felt awkward, almost forced, but as the days went by, they found themselves looking forward to those moments of connection. In those conversations, they rediscovered parts of each other that had been buried under the weight of routine and responsibility. David learned that Emily had been feeling just as disconnected as he had, that she had been struggling with her own fears about their relationship. Emily learned that David's insecurities stemmed not just from his feelings about Jake, but from a deeper fear of inadequacy that he had carried with him for years. As they opened up to each other, the emotional distance that had once felt insurmountable began to shrink. They started to find their way back to the closeness they had once shared, the easy intimacy that had defined their relationship in the early years of their marriage. But the process wasn't without its challenges. There were days when the old insecurities resurfaced, when the doubts and fears threatened to undo the progress they had made. David still struggled with the idea of Emily and Jake spending time together, and Emily still found herself feeling torn between her friendship with Jake and her commitment to David. It was during one of their counseling sessions that Dr. Lewis suggested a new approach. "It's clear that Jake has become an important part of your lives," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But it's also clear that his presence has created some tension in your marriage. I'd like to propose a meeting between the three of you, a chance to have an open, honest conversation about how you can all move forward in a way that feels comfortable for everyone." David felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest at the idea. The thought of sitting down with Jake and discussing their relationship felt daunting, but he also knew that it might be the only way to truly address the lingering tension. Emily seemed hesitant as well, but she nodded in agreement. "I think that might be a good idea," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's something we've been avoiding for a while, but maybe it's time to finally address it." The following week, they arranged to meet with Jake at a local park, a neutral, open space where they could talk without the distractions of the diner. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, the kind of day that would normally put David at ease, but as they walked towards the park, he felt a sense of apprehension building within him. Jake was already there when they arrived, sitting on a bench near a cluster of trees. He looked up as they approached, his expression friendly but also curious, as if he wasn't quite sure what to expect. "Hey, guys," Jake greeted them with a smile, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "What's going on?" David took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. "We wanted to talk to you about some things," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves that churned in his stomach. "There's been a lot of tension lately, and we think it's important to address it openly." Jake's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more serious expression. "Okay," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I've noticed that things have been a little off lately. I didn't want to push, but I'm glad you guys want to talk about it." Emily stepped in, her voice gentle as she explained. "Jake, we really value your friendship, and we don't want to lose that. But we also need to make sure that our marriage is strong, that we're prioritizing our relationship." Jake nodded, his gaze shifting between the two of them. "I totally get that. I've never wanted to come between you guys, and if I've done anything to make things harder, I'm really sorry." David appreciated the sincerity in Jake's voice, but he also knew that this conversation needed to be more than just apologies. "It's not about placing blame," he said, his tone firm but kind. "It's about finding a way to move forward that works for all of us. I've been feeling like an outsider lately, like I'm not really part of the dynamic between you and Emily. That's been hard for me to deal with, and I think it's something we need to address." Jake listened carefully, his expression thoughtful as he considered David's words. "I can understand that," he said after a moment. "And I don't want you to feel that way, David. Maybe we need to set some boundaries, figure out what everyone is comfortable with." Emily nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea. We all care about each other, but we need to make sure that we're respecting each other's needs and feelings." The conversation that followed was difficult, but it was also cathartic. They discussed the dynamics of their friendship, the impact it had on David and Emily's marriage, and the ways in which they could move forward with more clarity and mutual respect. They agreed to establish clearer boundaries. Jake would make an effort to include David in their conversations and activities, and Emily would be more mindful of how her friendship with Jake affected David. They also agreed to spend more time together as a group, rather than just Emily and Jake hanging out alone. By the end of the conversation, David felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there would likely be challenges ahead, but it was a start, a step towards healing and rebuilding the trust that had been strained. As they left the park, David felt a renewed sense of hope. The path to healing was still unfolding, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were all on the same page, working towards a common goal. That night, as he and Emily sat on the couch together, talking quietly about the day, David felt a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. The shadows that had loomed over their relationship were beginning to lift, replaced by the warm light of understanding and commitment. "We'll be okay," Emily said softly, her head resting on David's shoulder. "I know it won't be easy, but I really believe we'll get through this." David wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I believe that too," he replied, his voice steady and sure. "As long as we keep talking, keep working on it, we'll be okay." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the future felt more certain, more secure. The road ahead might be long and winding, but they were ready to face it together, hand in hand, with the promise of a stronger, deeper connection guiding them forward. In the weeks that followed their conversation at the park, David, Emily, and Jake worked hard to adjust to their new boundaries and rebuild the trust that had been strained. The initial tension that had once hung over them like a storm cloud began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism that they were all moving in the right direction. At the Sunshine Diner, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. There was a new dynamic between the three of them, one that was more balanced, more mindful of each other's feelings. Jake, true to his word, made an effort to include David in their conversations and activities, ensuring that he never felt like an outsider again. He also made a conscious decision to step back a little, giving David and Emily the space they needed to reconnect and strengthen their relationship. Emily, too, was more aware of how her actions affected David. She made it a point to spend quality time with him outside of work, rekindling the connection they had once shared. They took long walks together, revisited old favorite spots in town, and even started planning a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the routine of the diner and focus solely on each other. Despite the progress they were making, there were still moments of discomfort, times when old insecurities would resurface, threatening to undo the progress they had made. But each time, they faced those challenges head-on, using the tools they had learned in counseling to navigate their way through the rough patches. One evening, as the three of them were closing up the diner after a particularly busy day, Jake turned to David with a smile. "Hey, David, I was thinking about that concert we talked about a while back. I know it didn't happen the way we planned, but what do you say we all go together this weekend? It could be fun, and I think it would be a good way for us to hang out outside of work." David hesitated for a moment, the memory of their earlier conflicts flickering in his mind. But then he looked at Jake, saw the genuine desire to make things right, and felt a sense of warmth spread through him. This was exactly the kind of effort they had all agreed to make, and he knew it was important to embrace these opportunities. "Yeah, that sounds good," David replied, smiling back. "Let's do it." Emily, who had been wiping down the counter, looked up with a grin. "That sounds like a great idea. We could all use a night out." The weekend arrived quickly, and before they knew it, they were standing outside the concert venue, the evening air buzzing with anticipation. The sky was a deep shade of indigo, and the stars were just beginning to twinkle above them. The street was filled with the hum of excitement, people milling about, chatting animatedly as they waited to enter the venue. David, Emily, and Jake stood in line together, the camaraderie between them feeling more natural and relaxed than it had in months. As they made their way inside, the familiar sounds of tuning instruments and the low rumble of the crowd filled the air, creating a palpable sense of energy that wrapped around them like a warm blanket. The venue was intimate, with a small stage at the front and rows of chairs arranged around it. The three of them found seats near the center, close enough to see the band clearly but far enough back to have a good view of the entire stage. As they settled in, David felt a sense of excitement bubbling up inside him. It had been a long time since he had felt this way, anticipating something fun, something he could enjoy without the weight of his worries hanging over him. As the lights dimmed and the first notes of music filled the air, David glanced over at Emily, who was smiling broadly, her eyes shining with excitement. Jake was beside her, equally animated, and for a moment, David felt a pang of the old jealousy. But then he reminded himself of the progress they had made, of the trust they were rebuilding, and the feeling quickly passed. The band was fantastic, their music a blend of energetic rock and soulful ballads that had the crowd swaying and singing along. David found himself getting lost in the music, the rhythm and melodies washing over him, carrying away the lingering doubts and insecurities that had plagued him for so long. Throughout the concert, David noticed how different things felt between them. Emily made a point of including him in the fun, pulling him into spontaneous dance circles, sharing jokes, and pointing out little details in the music that she knew he would appreciate. Jake, too, was careful to keep the balance, engaging both David and Emily equally, making sure that no one felt left out. As the night went on, David found himself relaxing more and more, the tension that had once defined his interactions with Jake slowly fading away. By the time the concert ended, and they were walking back to their car, David felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't experienced in months. "That was amazing," Emily said, her voice full of enthusiasm as they made their way through the crowd. "I'm so glad we did this." "Yeah, it was a great night," Jake agreed, smiling at both of them. "I'm really glad we could all go together." David nodded, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Me too. This was exactly what we needed." As they drove home, the night air cool and refreshing against their skin, David couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road to healing had been long and difficult, filled with moments of doubt and uncertainty, but they had made it through. They had learned to communicate more openly, to trust each other more deeply, and to navigate the complexities of their relationships with care and understanding. When they arrived back at their house, Emily and David said goodnight to Jake and headed inside, their hearts light and their spirits lifted. As they settled onto the couch, talking quietly about the concert and the night they had shared, David felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken together. "We've come a long way," Emily said softly, her head resting on David's shoulder. "Yeah, we have," David agreed, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'm so glad we did." Emily looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and affection. "I love you, David. I'm so proud of us, for getting through this, for working so hard to make things better." David leaned down and kissed her softly, his heart swelling with love. "I love you too, Emily. And I'm proud of us too. We're stronger because of this, and I know we'll keep getting stronger." As they sat together in the quiet of their home, the future felt bright and full of promise. The challenges they had faced had only deepened their bond, and David knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, with the same determination and love that had carried them through the darkest days. The next day at the diner, the atmosphere was light and cheerful. The customers were in high spirits, the morning sun streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow over the familiar space. David, Emily, and Jake worked together seamlessly, their interactions easy and natural, a reflection of the hard work they had put into rebuilding their relationships. There were still occasional moments of tension, small reminders that the healing process was ongoing, that trust was something that needed to be nurtured and maintained. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between, replaced by a growing sense of confidence and stability. As the lunch rush began to wind down, and the last of the customers finished their meals, David found himself reflecting on the journey they had all been on. It hadn't been easy. There had been times when he had wondered if they would ever find their way back to each other, if the fractures in their relationships were too deep to heal. But they had persevered, and now, standing in the warmth of the diner, surrounded by the people he cared about most, David knew that it had all been worth it. In the weeks that followed, the new normal they had established continued to take root. David and Emily spent more time together outside of work, rekindling the connection that had once defined their marriage. They went on long walks, had quiet dinners at home, and even started planning that weekend getaway they had talked about. Jake, too, became more integrated into their lives, not as a source of tension, but as a valued friend who understood the boundaries they had set. One evening, as they were all sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the quiet streets of their neighborhood, David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the air was cool and fresh, and the world felt calm and still. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a chance to take stock of everything they had been through and to appreciate the journey they had all undertaken together. As the last rays of sunlight faded, and the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, David turned to Emily, his heart full of love and gratitude. "We've been through a lot," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "But I wouldn't trade any of it, because it brought us to where we are now." Emily smiled, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "Me neither," she replied, her voice equally soft. "We're stronger because of it. And I know that whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Jake, who had been quietly listening to their conversation, nodded in agreement. "You guys are amazing. I'm just glad I could be part of this journey with you." David smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment wash over him. "We're glad you're part of it too, Jake. We've all grown because of this, and I think we're all better for it." As they sat together in the quiet of the evening, the world around them slowly fading into night, David knew that they had built something strong and lasting, something that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. And as the first stars appeared in the sky, twinkling like distant beacons of hope, David felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. They had faced their fears, navigated the complexities of their relationships, and come out stronger on the other side. The road to healing had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every step. With Emily by his side and Jake as a trusted friend, David knew that the future was bright, full of promise and possibility. They had built a new normal, one that was rooted in love, trust, and a deep understanding of each other. And as they faced the future together, hand in hand, David knew that they were ready for whatever came next. As David, Emily, and Jake navigate the complexities of their intertwined lives, they emerge stronger, with a renewed sense of trust and understanding. The journey wasn't easy, but through honest conversations and setting clear boundaries, they rebuild the foundation of their relationships. In the end, David realizes that the shadows of doubt can only be dispelled by the light of open communication and mutual respect. As they move forward, they embrace a future full of promise, knowing that true love can weather even the most challenging storms.